Today's guest is Max Kantelia, entrepreneur, investor, wine lover, very important for this conversation, and co-founder of the blockchain platform Zilliqa. Max has spent more than 25 years building companies across deep tech, finance, music, luxury, and gaming, always with an eye on how technology and culture collide. In a 2022 TEDx talk, Max described the multisensory future of culture. And this is a vision where our identities, our ownership, our experiences flow seamlessly across physical and digital spaces. It's a vision that luxury brands are already experimenting with, and one that raises urgent questions for heritage industries like wine. So today, we're asking Max, what can wine learn from Web3, from gaming, from fandoms, and from the long game of building cultures that endure? Max, welcome.
Thank you, Polly. It's an absolute pleasure to be here.
You are hard to pin down. You are a world traveler as you're out talking about Zilliqa, talking about Web3, blockchain. I know you've got a great team behind you. I will say that most of us probably don't understand it quite as well as you do. So right off the bat, let's just start with some basic definition, understanding, and placements. So when we think about blockchain nowadays, right, we think about 2020 and crypto speculation. And how can you describe what it is that you do to me like I'm five, or to me like I've had 3 glasses of wine and I'm sitting across you at a dinner party?
Okay, so first of all, let's just start with clarifying this term Web3, because Web3 means 1,000 different things to different people. For me, it's quite simple, though. Web 1 was actually about read. So this thing called the internet allowed you to go to a website and you could read about anything you wanted to learn about. Okay. Web 2 was about read and write. You could now use social media platforms. You can email people. And so not only do you just read things, you can actually write to the internet. Web 3 is about read, write, and own. Okay, so Web 3 becomes not just about those things we're already accustomed to, but it's also about self-custody and ownership. And that's what the blockchain layer really allows you to do. The other thing I would explain to you is that in Web 1, your identity was your email address. In Web 2, your identity increased to your social media handles. And in Web 3, your avatar will become your identity, and it will be KYC'd and can hold all sorts of information and data about you privately if you wish, or publicly if you wish. I would say that those are really important basic things to understand.
Those are the basics. Okay, so kind of moving beyond that, we've got this notion of an ecosystem, right? So it's, if we think sort of in 1 dimension, in 2 dimension, in 3 dimensions. So now we're working in 3 dimensions, and with that comes this whole system. What does that actually look like in practice? So again, this is the explain it to me like I'm 5. Where are we going with this?
So where we are focusing at the moment is on looking at what I think is a major industrial application for all of these technologies. So again, let's just simplify for a moment. When people talk about an ecosystem, let me, because you know my other passion is cars, I'll have to use a car analogy. A car is made up of many different components, as we all know, from the engine to the braking system, to the exhaust system, to the suspension. And in a sense, a car in itself is an ecosystem that is made up of many different components. A component on its own is not really very helpful or useful. And so in terms of all these technologies that certainly we are working with today across my companies, we have an underlying blockchain, which is called Zilliqa, as you know. We have a spatial web technology company that's called MetaMinds. We have in all of those companies, we're using AI in its many different forms. But an ecosystem has to have all of these components. And so for the last 10 years, what I've been doing, Polly, is creating companies that are different components of an overall vision that I had 10 years ago. And it's only now that that vision is starting to come true, where we join all of these things together to provide, I think, what you had already referred to, which is a combined physical plus digital experience. And that's really where I'm focused today. But it needs for you to be able to join up the dots. I've always been told I was quite good at joining up dots. And that's exactly what I'm doing. So that's what an ecosystem is.
And so that's where we get into this concept of the multisensory experiences, as well as the multiple ventures that you've been involved in over time. So yes. It sounds on the surface like a technical solution. How is this actually, how is this cultural? How does this integrate into the fabric of our daily lives and eventually become a cultural entity rather than a technical solution?
Well, let's look back to the mid-90s, Polly, when this thing called the World Wide Web and this thing called the internet was born. It was a place for deep techies. And I remember the Telegraph, the Guardian, and all sorts of newspapers saying that this thing would never fly. It was clumsy, it was awkward, it would never ever fly. And now look where we are today. In a sense, Web3 and that ecosystem I referred to, where you have an immersive form of the internet, coupled with a blockchain or Web3 based infrastructure, this is still very early days. And people still say the metaverse is dead. Well, it's not actually, but it just is called different things today. You know, this is relevant for what we're going to talk about, but today there are something like 450 million active avatars on social gaming platforms, particularly Roblox and Fortnite. So these aren't gamers, but these are people whose avatars talk to other people's avatars, for example. And so for me, the around, particularly in response to your question, I think that we have to look at current behaviors and how they shape the future of heritage industries in particular. And for 6 years now, in fact, ever since COVID, when I became fascinated by how my nephews and nieces were spending 8 or 9 hours a day, their avatars talking to their friends' avatars. Whereas people of my age would be very happy every 2 weeks to have a Zoom call with a glass of wine, you know, with friends. And it's really important to understand what happened during that lockdown time. Actually, it was these younger Gen Alpha and Gen Z people across the world that were adopting a new way of communicating with each other. And we didn't do that. But I became fascinated by this.
I love that you're talking about that, because my daughter in 2020, my youngest daughter, was the one in her friend group who was spinning up the Minecraft servers so that they could all get into Minecraft. And she's now, you know, about to graduate from university. And she was home this summer. She was telling me about a mathematician. So it's like a university level math professor who discovered Minecraft and decided that he was actually going to go into Minecraft and build a computer and do the entire thing streamed. And, you know, to say to someone, yeah, my daughter's sitting around watching a university maths professor create a computer in Minecraft, sounds completely bonkers. But she knows all about this guy. There's a total community watching him do this, like very, very interested in it. And it is, in a sense, I don't want to call it a subculture because I think that even that is too simplistic, but it is a community of people who have perhaps only one shared interest, but that is the space that they come together. And from that, they grow into a multitude of perhaps more niche or more subcultural communities. I mean, obviously, community and culture is a really big thing. So you've worked in luxury, finance, gaming, tech. So when we're looking at creating communities, are there lessons that wine can learn about new community building? So not this sort of, I mean, you and I are both of an age where we love wine and we kind of drink it in the same way, but that's really changing. So what can we learn from these communities that you are watching being built in the early days?
So a community that I think provides us with some rationale is actually the world of art, Polly, because you will read almost every day that the art world is shrinking and values are diminishing tremendously. But it's really interesting. I was looking at the art industry last year, and what's actually happening is that I think the global art market last year declined by, I don't know, 12, 13%. So the value of transactions dropped like this, but the number of transactions went up because actually the drag in that industry is at the very high end. But what's happening in art is that younger people are embracing it. They're coming into the art industry, and okay, they're not spending hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars on art, but they're coming in. And I've spoken to a number of people in the industry who are fascinated by how many young people want to buy art at an entry level. But these young people, these Gen Zers in particular, ask a lot of questions. They want to know about the artist. They want to know everything about the artist. They want to know what inspires the artist. And it's really interesting because I think that whether it's fashion, art, perhaps even the F&B industries, I think the people who resonate with these younger generations are the ones that are going to succeed for the future.
100%.
Right. And whilst right now, we know that the consumption of alcohol is decreasing because younger people are not they're not drinking very much, and in some cases not at all. And so I keep coming back to the vision that I had, 5 or 6 years ago for what we're now doing with luxury e-commerce in all of its formats, that we have to pay attention right now, first and foremost, to this segment of the worldwide population. And so when people, particularly in the world of luxury, start talking to me about the demise of the Chinese consumer, the Russian consumer, and who's next? Is it the Indian consumer? I actually say to them, you're looking at the wrong data point, because we can argue until the cows come home as to which geographical group of people comes next. Instead, I tell people to look at hard facts. I mean, the Gen Z and Gen Alpha population combined, as you may already know, are part of this thing called the Great Wealth Transfer, Polly.
So I know we've talked about this a lot. Yeah.
In sort of 2033 to 2035, $74 trillion worth of wealth passes from our generation down to this generation. And this makes them the wealthiest a group of people in history. Okay, so if we don't, and that's hard data, you can't argue with that. That's fact. And so for me, understanding how this generation is going to be consuming luxury, whether it's wine or scarves or watches, I think there's a common pattern. And as I was saying to you earlier, I think we can learn a little bit about what's happening in the world of art, because these younger buyers are making decisions based on sustainability, for example, right? Which I would say that maybe our generation wasn't so concerned about, right? And transparency, what are the components or the ingredients that make this beautiful bottle of wine or a cash sweater, and are sustainable practices being used? And I think that understanding these behaviors is essential to all of these industries, including our beloved wine industry.
So I love that you talked about art and these notions of sustainability and transparency, because we've just released a report that is for the wine industry, but not from the wine industry, that is all about trust and under 35-year-olds. So how is trust being built? How is it repaired? Where does it fail? Sort of the, who, what, when, where, why of it. And if we go back to the notion of how we're engaging and building communities, the things that we know, of course, is that what's happening through creation, co-creation, collaboration, streaming services is invaluable, but also this notion of triangulation. So there's some language that is their post-trust consumers, when in fact, if you look at it, what's happening is they're just rebuilding the mechanisms of trust. And they know, so someone like a Gen Zer has grown up in an environment where they have an innate cynicism. And they know that if they see a good review, go check it out in a handful of other places to see, well, what else is everyone saying? And also check with the boss or check with the parent or check with an expert. And it's fascinating how there's not one point of data that sells them on something. Whereas maybe when you and I were growing up, we had the newspaper, we had magazines, and we would be very heavily influenced by what Consumer Reports said or a magazine review said. Whereas now the generations are going out to find more. And I saw, I'm going to completely forget her name. I will have to add it to the show notes. My daughter, who is 24, and I went to South by Southwest London. And we saw Imogen Heap, that's her name, speak at South by Southwest. And she's big into AI and multisensory experiences and all of these things. But she was talking about how she's trying to build a platform where musicians can actually unify and control their own identity. So it is using blockchain, it is using verification, but she explained the problem for them is that their narrative is in the hands of so many intermediaries that they cannot actually pull all of everything they've done, everything they've participated in. Like, she's very sort of Renaissance woman, does art and music and performance. And so I wonder about that when we're talking about something like Zilliqa and the ecosystem and our avatars, what that means for verification of trust and what it also means for our ability to literally control the public narrative of ourselves as these next generations come of age.
Yes. So, Polly, when we first launched Zilliqa in Singapore in the, it was period between 2015 and 2017, and I used to be asked to speak to people in Singapore, industrialists, families, government officials, I would have just one slide on a screen. And it basically said blockchain, and underneath it, it said the trust machine. And I used to call it the trust machine because it is exactly that if used appropriately. And what makes me actually angry and very, very upset is that recently, in just the last 8 weeks, no names mentioned, we've seen luxury brands who sell products at the highest price points being caught out because they're in their supply chains, they're using slave
Laura
labor.
Piana, I'll say it. I've just had to write about it, as a really great example, has been put under administration because of it.
A brand that I used to love, but no longer, I'm afraid. Um, and the good news is that all of these brands know that they could use this technology to actually underpin their supply chains and prove that they have sustainable, humane practices. I'll give you another example. When Zilliqa was first born, a luxury brand in Southeast Asia wanted to use our technology to conduct an experiment because part of their business was actually in the world of fragrances. And they wanted to use our technology to provide provenance for one ingredient that they use in their oldest and best-selling perfume. And when we tried to launch a project, 3 or 4 major actors in their supply chain refused to comply. They didn't want to be part of the project. And in fact, the project never happened.
Wow.
And guess what? Well, we know why. But the family that has owned this particular luxury brand for generations trusted the supply chain more so than they did the idea of a technology being able to provide provenance. So I think that there is an issue out there. There's a big issue, and we know this exists in the wine industry too, particularly the fake industry. And so the good news is that today blockchains, if used properly and correctly, can provide a very safe mechanism for provenance and authenticity. And that's a tremendous use case for blockchain in the world of luxury, whether it's cars or wine or cashmere sweaters, actually.
I think it's interesting, though, like in doing this research for the report, the thing that we found was not a demand for perfection. It was a demand for truth. And, in wine, in luxury, in industries, things can go wrong. We are obviously right now in the midst of enormous evolution in wine simply because of climate issues, right? And so we've got wineries that are having to rethink practices. There's a lot of improvement, and I love that. But I've had wineries where something goes wrong in the winery. These brands are often quite worried about, what if I'm not doing everything perfectly? And I try to say to them, well, number one, covering your ass is really important, and doing it with truth is much better than obfuscation. But I do think that if we establish a notion of, you might not always like what I'm going to tell you, but I'm always going to tell you the truth, that a brand as a whole, we become that much more resilient and trustworthy, which then really carries into what these under 35s are expecting from their brands.
Yes, and completely. We could actually talk about this all day long. I think this strive for utter perfection sometimes holds people back from just initially doing some experimentation. And this is actually how my group of companies is working with luxury brands today. We don't talk about what we're doing, and neither do they, because you have to experiment with new technologies before you learn how they really could be applied to your business. You have to do that without telling the world, because if that's where the whole NFT thing went wrong. There are brands last year that Porsche even.
Is NFT still a thing? Like, is the way that we saw it in years past with like the NFT art and the NFT sort of tokens and all that, like, is this still a thing?
the technology is absolutely there because what we're really talking about is tokenization. The T stands for token.
Yeah.
Right? So Bitcoin is a token. Our cryptocurrency, ZIL, is a token. Stable coins, which a lot of people are talking about, are tokens. So actually, no, I mean, that term has stopped being used because
Okay. All right.
it's not a good look anymore. But people talk about digital assets these days. But the purpose of what we call the NFT is still very much alive and can provide a digital asset can provide provenance for its physical counterpart. And in terms of what we're trying to do in the world of luxury, for example, what we're working towards is a physical plus digital solution for brands that today, but luxury brands are having a bad moment, as we all know. And last week I was at the Luxury Innovation Summit in Geneva, where I think we initially met a few
Met
years
last year. That's right. Yep.
you know, we had quite a big role to play, my group, in what we were doing. And again, it was fascinating that all of the brands, instead of selling themselves, were actually talking about the problems and how they are trying to look at solutions to some of the issues that are dogging the world of luxury today. And there was a fascinating exchange, some of which is actually on LinkedIn. You can see it.
I'll go find that because I think that we need to hear. I mean, I was at that summit last year, and of course, the things that we get in these very, I don't want to say private spaces, but they're not gargantuan conferences, right? Is that I remember last year there were some people who were speaking very, very openly about adoption, about, you know, where new tech is coming from, about generations, about saying no. I think that was something that I remember from last year. So I will get that LinkedIn link from you and drop it into the show notes.
And what's interesting, Polly, is that we in fact, I met somebody 2 or 3 years ago at that event who at the time was one of the heads of innovation for Richemont Group, which, as you know, owns Cartier and many, many, many brands. And 6 months ago, he joined us. And the fact that somebody from that world has joined us because he sees the light is the big change in what I see at events and conferences now. And whether I'm talking about luxury or wine or technology, these luxury brands are beginning to understand they have to do something. They have to start doing things a bit differently.
So with that in mind, you have spoken about this notion of real utility, right? Which from a very amorphous, what is this? How does it work? What's the applicability? When you look at this term real utility, so first, like, what does that mean for anybody who's not thinking of real utility the same way that you are? And then given what you know about luxury and wine, and I mean, wine I think is so interesting because multisensory means so much in the context of wine. How can what you're doing, blockchain, Web3, physical digital experiences, provide real utility to heritage brands, luxury brands, sensory-based brands?
I think that these technologies have multiple use cases. For a start, it's people today talk about AI as though it's the only thing, it's the only technology, and that's really blind. Actually, it's a component. It's a component of an ecosystem. So I think that there are a number of things that we can genuinely solve using these technologies. And what I mean by that, I don't decry anybody that's experimenting, and that's why, you know, NFTs of clowns became really popular about 5 years ago, and they were selling on the aftermarket for ridiculous amounts of money, right? That was all experimentation. I've avoided all of that. I've focused very long term think through long term thinking, which is how I think about technology. I don't think about it in short bursts. Is how do we actually apply these technologies to solving big industrial problems? As an entrepreneur, that's what drives me to build things. It's big, nasty problems. And I see right the way through the customer experience, I see how technology can help today. Just a few weeks ago, a dear friend of mine walked through a major department store in London, shall remain nameless, and she took 140 photographs of shop assistants doing this instead of serving the customer. I happen to know somebody who owns that store, and she asked me to send these photographs to that person. I did. Horrified, absolutely horrified. And I think that's where the problem is starting. I see it in the world of luxury at every level today, whether it's wine or whether it's perfume or whether it's fashion. I think that you're sort of charmed up until the point of purchase, and then you're forgotten about. And so this is where, for example, physical plus digital in the worlds we're creating, where we're about to launch a world of luxury that is immersive, where your avatar can go shopping and you can look at things. And AI agents will tell you all about that product. You can look at how the interior of the watch is made. You can learn all about the history of the brand. And then once you've purchased this, through tokenization of think about loyalty as a great example. I am constantly told that we have, as a family, so many loyalty points, and we never use them. And that's because I don't really want a microwave oven. I'm not that interested, actually.
You don't want your free toaster? Come on, Max.
I'll send you one. But I think that technology and how it embraces the end customer, how it builds a relationship with that customer and builds what you've talked about a lot, which is community. I think that word is becoming so important now. Brands have to build strong links with their communities. And again, Gen Zers are not just interested in the ownership of this pen. They want to know what experiences, special experiences, come with ownership of that product. So it's not just about owning the product, it's about an experience. And this is where, Polly, my term multisensory experiences comes into play. And I'll give you a wonderful example. Just actually a couple of months ago, through a lovely dear friend, Francesca Massoni, who she and her brother run a winery in Piedmont, and it's called the Marchesi in Chiesa della Rocetta. And Francesca, other than being a winemaker and a former very successful hedge fund manager, is a patron of the arts. And she organized an incredible event where she had 8 of the world's top ballet performers performing sets in her vineyard whilst we were drinking her beautiful wines. And people in the audience were not just there to drink the wine. Some of them were there just to watch the ballet, and some were there to drink the wine. But it's when you combine these experiences together, we still talk about that experience because it was incredible. And so I think that technology allows us to create these multisensory experiences and in a way that you can't actually do today. And this is where I feel that luxury brands need to work quite hard. And Polly, I'll give you a few more data points. So last weekend I was at Goodwood Revival, which is an incredible event, as you well know. And it was amazing, lots and lots of beautiful old cars, people dressed up in 40s and 50s fashion. It was absolutely wonderful. What was really interesting, though, was that the new Rolls-Royce factory is actually based on Goodwood grounds now. It's next door to.
Really?
Yes. The average age of a Rolls-Royce owner is early 30s. You believe that? And so this is a heritage brand that you would imagine would be facing, headwinds. They had their best ever year last year. And what's happening is that younger people are buying these cars, not using them terribly much, but they love the fact that this is a heritage brand.
And it's handmade, and I will say, and it has an investment value, and it's something that they can touch and feel. Yeah.
Exactly. And so I think that coming back to our core topic today, I think that winemakers, particularly those where ownership is being passed to perhaps younger family members, I think need to look very, very carefully at how, obviously, given what you do for a living, my dear, how they market to these audiences in a very, very different way. And I think that combining channeling partnerships is really, really important. Francesca, whom I was speaking about earlier, partnered with the Royal Opera House during COVID so that people got sent bottles of wine with very special labels, with Royal Opera House labels. So I think brands need to come together and work together to provide these experiences in a sort of a combinatorial way. And I think that the wine industry does need to look very, very carefully at how they perhaps do that, because we see falling consumption, and that's frightening a little bit to see what could happen to some incredible heritage brands.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there are so many things. I've been taking notes as you've been talking that I want to ask about. So when we're talking about ballet in the vineyard at the winery, the immediate ping is, oh, this sounds like a very expensive ticket. But then when you get beyond that, is there a goal for any of the brands that you work with to, for want of a better word, democratize some of these experiences? Because I would think that in the context of what you do, you don't have to be there part of it has the potential to open doors for, say, younger non-Rolls-Royce purchasers who do have an affinity for, if they're more interested in the ballet, or they're more interested in the sustainability, or more interested in the slow living. And that brings them into a space where wine is one of the co-creators, but it's not the core. So does this all take money and big tickets and exclusivity, or can it make way for more engaged audience?
So it's a great question. And it begs for us to define what we mean by luxury, because that term in itself is it can be translated in
different for everyone
in so many ways. I mean, for example, right now we are working very closely with beauty brands. We're working with jewelry brands. We're working with streetwear brands run by brave young entrepreneurs who absolutely see what we've been talking about today. And in fact, we are going to be working very closely with the British Beauty Council to do something really exciting during London Fashion Week this year.
Nice.
All right. And so you don't have to, we don't have to refer to luxury at that enormous price point alone, because there are other starting points for this. And I think that the wine industry can absolutely learn from that, because you and I both know that, of course, scarcity, supply and demand, good old fashioned economics plays a part in price point. We all know that, right? And I am certainly not trying to democratize luxury. Luxury is luxury in whatever format, and we shouldn't try and democratize that. But I think that what's interesting for me is that there are new brands, whether they be in wine or whether they be in fashion, that are great starting points for experimenting with these technologies. And I think that the Uber brands will learn from maybe some of that experimentation. And by the way, it's already starting to happen. I'm seeing virtual immersive activations happening in here on Bond Street in London with age-old brands, doing things that they perhaps would never have done before. And that I think is just momentum. It's about momentum. It just, I think there's a tide coming, and it's driven by commercial imperative.
I think it's interesting. So I interviewed Charles Basile, who's the CMO, head of brand for BBC. And in that interview, one thing that came up is this notion that we talk about lifetime value of our customers. But as marketers, one of the things that as marketers and brands we're talking about is lifetime value of the brand entity for the customers. Like, how do we actually create, convey, maintain an ongoing, this beautiful lifetime value where we are a part of, whether it's every day or on demand, what they need from us, and that we're really empathetically problem solving. And I think that one of the things, to be fair, that concerns me, because we've worked in digital and wine for 10 years now, is that wine as an industry remains, in a pretty early phase of adopting digital. And I worry about bandwagon jumping, right? So shiny new toy. So there's a space where you need to get in, you need to play without shipping it. I mean, I think that's so important. You said that earlier. Not everything that you do has to be talked about. So you can go in, work with it, and learn. I do worry that there would be some element of kind of like with AI, oh, yes, we're going to adopt it, and everybody's going to throw out some half-assed version of what it is. So for a brand that is new to all of this, but they're interested, next generation is taking control, and they're like, what could this mean to us and our brand? Where do they start with that process?
We encourage people who are interested in the use of technology for the solution of these problems we've been talking about, to conduct very small private experiments, usually with their best customers. So imagine doing a wine tasting in a virtual setting. And that sounds ridiculous, but it's not actually. So you can imagine that you could have we could actually recreate a vineyard in the spatial web, or the metaverse as it used to be called. We can recreate a beautiful vineyard, and the avatar of the owner can actually talk us through a wine tasting. And you can have people who are seated in London or Hong Kong or Singapore or New York who, okay, at this point may have to wear some augmentation,
right?
But suddenly their avatar is in a vineyard. They have a glass of wine by their side, and they're listening to an avatar talking about that particular wine, tasting notes. That could be followed by a musical performance. All of this is turned into a digital asset that's collectible. And a few days later, maybe a case of special wine arrives to commemorate that event. So these are the sorts of experiments that I think brands need to look at. Multisensory, that involve numerous things, because some of the people around the table might not be wine drinkers, but they might love music.
What I think I just want to flag in this discussion. So my husband is an old school gamer, right? And so I've seen the evolution of game graphics and animation. So like my husband plays, amongst other things, he plays Star Citizen. I don't know if you know anything about sort of the history and the funding and the building and all of this of Star Citizen. And, I think that it's really important to flag that when people hear what you've just said, I think they picture Legend of Zelda style graphics in a Minecraft kind of world, in something that is very lo-fi, right? I don't think that they're understanding or seeing where even something like avatar, it's not the memoji on your iPhone, where a representation of self is moving toward the matrix, quite honestly. And I think that that's probably one of the hardest things whenever I hear brands sort of throw up opposition to this notion of the spatial web, is that how does it carry over the beauty and the sensation?
We have worked insanely hard for 3 years to solve that problem.
Really?
Because I did not want to create an environment that looked like a game or a cartoon. I wanted to create an environment that looks like this.
Yeah.
I wanted to create, and we've created an environment that, depending on your preferences, can look like Bond Street in London or Place Vendôme in Paris or Dubai Mall. But the sensation and the texturing, the coloring, the shadowing is incredibly lifelike. Wow. And we have a CTO who worked at Meta, and he's an absolutely brilliant man. And we've cracked that problem. So even with a phone, you can enter worlds that don't look like cartoons. They look like Mayfair. And that's very, very difficult to do technologically without burning holes in the planet. But we've done it. So that breakthrough alone, when we show people what we can now do when we take you inside a browser, an immersive browser, is quite mind-blowing. But you are absolutely spot on, because when we first talk to brands, they're hugely skeptical, because they want their pen to look like this. They don't want silly, cartoon-like. And that's a difficult problem to solve, but we have solved that now. And you are spot on, because without that, luxury brands will not take this seriously.
I want to see that. And then I think about that, and I think about even just iPhone, was it 26? iOS 26 just came out, and the ability for the in real time translation. Right. So now in this point, in these spaces, it's very much the sci-fi world that you and I would have grown up in. I can sit here with my little headset on if I need it, and I'm able to speak in my language, in my world, and live in a space, exist in a space. What is it? Was it Ready Player One? I know there are all of these game references, but it's the Ready Player One space, right? That we're there and we are living whole lives. I don't necessarily say that that's where it's going tomorrow. But as a kid who grew up loving sci-fi, like I actually am really fascinated by this, simply because it's the hologram deck, when in Star Trek, it's all these spaces that we can go. I mean, that's probably one of the best examples I can think of, is that we can go into a space and transport ourselves back to the 1940s with Captain Picard and live our little, dream experience, and then come back out into the real world. Okay, what adoption and cultural adoption. We've talked a lot about brands adopting this technology. I want to wrap up with the question of, what does it take for the audience to adopt this? Because not every kid grew up watching Star Trek and Star Wars and playing games and has this sort of, ooh, I'm getting there, sort of fascination with it. How do you even have to get the next generations, or is it just natural for them? Is your challenge trying to get, a boomer or a 60-year-old to adopt it, but the 17, 18, 22-year-olds, they're down with it already?
Well, as we were talking about earlier, if you look at the number of people that are already active on social gaming platforms, which doesn't mean they're gamers, by the way. I think you understand the difference here. I saw a statistic just very recently that said that 1 in 2.36 people on the planet today, in some way or other, engages with a social gaming or a gaming platform. That's incredible. So
I want to interrupt to flag. And if you look at something like Roblox, which for anybody who's listening who doesn't know what it is, you need to go look it up, because Roblox started as a very kids space. I mean, like, this was very simple, and I'm not advocating necessarily for early indoctrination, but at the same time, when you think that there are people who literally started here as children, this is so native to them.
These kids, these Gen Zers I was talking about, that my nieces and nephews in particular, that I was so fascinated by during COVID, to them, physical and digital are singular. One supports the other. It's not just one or the other. Digital and physical are as a singular experience. So I think that's already coming. I think that's coming. I think the issue here is that luxury brands, whether it's wine producers or people that make pens, need to understand how they appeal to that generation. So
the adoption is already primed. We just have to find our way in. I think that's something, though, that's super interesting about that, and a problem that I do see with wine. There's this thing called legal drinking age. And I think that wine, and obviously we don't breach that, but I think that maybe sometimes what happens in the wine industry is that we don't really start thinking about them until they get to legal drinking age, as opposed to wine. I've been saying for 10 years that wine needed to be paying attention to audiences who were under 21. I remember giving the How to Sell Wine to Millennials talk so many times. I was like, will you just never have me show up to give this talk again? Because millennials are 40 now. And so something like saying, okay, look at what's happening with Roblox or with any of the gaming streaming spaces, because yes, they might be Gen Alpha right now, but if you don't understand the world in which they are growing up, you won't be ready when the day comes that they are ready for you.
Yes, absolutely. And I don't know if you're familiar with this term that, again, the last few weeks at the Luxury Innovation Summit, people were increasingly using, was sober curious.
Yeah, it's a thing.
And so, it's almost, there's almost a culture amongst these younger people where drinking's not normalized and it's almost fashionable not to drink.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting research about what's going on with all of
that. I know. And that in itself is very, very interesting. And then, of course, there are all sorts of other reasons, right? Financial concerns, sustainability concerns. In fact, last night I had a beautiful bottle of 1996 Ponte Canet with somebody who's a wine collector but doesn't drink anymore.
That's a very good friend to have, Max, because he's going to need somebody to drink all of his excellent wine.
We should meet that person and talk some more together.
We need that person. Absolutely. So you do love wine. One of the reasons that I wanted to have you in this space, you love wine. You've got years of enjoying collectible wine, library wines. You travel, you tour, you live in a kind of nice luxury space that I think is lovely. May I want to live in. Recommendation. Other than getting to know who that customer is for a wine brand listening, who's trying to become more culturally aware of what's coming down the pike. Recommendation, starting point.
Identify up and coming brands in different areas of the luxury world, and then experiment together with those brands and maybe their followers or their communities. Quiet, experimentation to see what the art of the possible actually is without sort of, pushing it away and saying that'll never work. So experiment quietly, find people to collaborate with that already have communities and followers and work together.
I love it. I could not have said that better. Max, thank you so much for your time. I feel like we could just keep talking. So we may have to do this again next year and find out, okay, what's new, because so much has changed. It's so opaque to a lot of us. And thank you for speaking about all of this in real human terms, because that makes a profound difference to our ability to actually see the future of where all this is going.
And I mean, thank you, Polly, for the work that you're doing in the space too, because you're part of the ecosystem.
I suppose we all are, right? That's the ecosystem. Thank you, Max. I will let you go be free until next year when we do this all again.